Getting started with ASP.NET MVC. Let me share my desktop for you. Strangely enough, I actually had a background picture that had the title of this talk, which is just Getting Started with ASP.NET MVC. For some reason it's not showing up here, and I'm going to choose not to care. So let's get started. My name is Eric Sowell. I am lead developer on the mobile team at Match.com. I spend all my day doing mobile web development, and I'm doing it all on ASP.NET MVC. I guess I've been programming about 10 years, and I started with web forms and got into MVC and really loved it. And so I've been spending a lot of time in it these last few years and doing a lot of talking about it. That's why I'm here to help you guys out today. My assumption is that most of you have not really done much ASP.NET MVC development before, or maybe looking for a refresher. That's what I'm here for. My basic assumptions are that you know C# and that you've used Visual Studio. I'm going to do my best to not assume that you've even had any background in web forms. And this is a beginner level talk, if the title wasn't obvious. This is getting started, so if you have a lot of experience in ASP.NET MVC, you will probably not learn a great deal. So this is to get people started. And this is also an open session in terms of questions. This is to get you ready for the conference, because a lot of the talks are going to have a lot of MVC content in it. So if you have questions about some of the technologies, I don't know them all, but I can at least answer some questions about some. If you have questions about the framework, I hope to leave plenty of time for questions at the end. We have technically an hour and a half, though they wanted us to go an hour and 15 minutes. I'm going to shoot for the content to go roughly an hour, so plenty of time. And at the end, we can just ask and answer questions and talk. Or if you want me to try something out and build something and show you how something works, I'll do that as well. So we'll be very flexible in this. And if I do happen to have a moderator here, he can stop me at any point, or anybody can ask a question if they want. Let's do a new project. Alright, so the way I tend to work whenever I'm talking to people about ASP.NET MVC, I go from the small pieces to the big picture. So what we're going to do is we're going to work through a lot of the little things. I'm going to start very, very simple, as simple as I possibly can. And then we're going to put pieces together. And so the way I like to start is we're going to take a ASP.NET MVC for web application. We're just going to create a new one here, and we're going to create an empty one and get started with that. And after MVC decides to create the project, as you can see, we're adding packages down here at the bottom, all of our dependencies. Here we go, Solution Explorer. This is what you get in a blank ASP.NET MVC application. There's not a whole lot. You've got a web config. If you've done any ASP.NET development, you're going to be quite familiar with the web config. This is a place to configure your applications. If you're not, you can set settings and read them later and use them. And as a text file, it's something you can just upload to the server. Okay, so there's a place for models, as you can see here, views and controllers. ASP.NET MVC, the MVC stands for models, views, and controllers. Those pieces are typically going to go in those folders if you just follow the basic convention. Other than that, we have routes and we have filters, which we're going to ignore entirely. Not the routes, just the filters. So this is your basic blank project. Now let's get started with routing. This route right here has to do with Web API, which we are not discussing today, so we don't really need it. This right here is the route we care about. So let's say we run this as is. We're going to hit Control F5. I'm going to get a browser. Basic browser window. Nothing's there. This is a blank project. There is no code yet. What we're going to start with are controllers and views. Later on we'll talk about models and how that fits into things. If you look at the route, I want you to notice something. First it says controller. This is the URL. And so if you have a URL, and let's say our URL is /home, that is going to map to something called a home controller. And this action right here is going to be the name of the action on that controller. So if we go to controllers, right click, add controller, we'll get a dialog. And we're going to say home controller. Whenever you create this empty home controller, it automatically comes with an index action. So if you look back at your route, see action here will be the second part of the URL. So we could put index here. So this should pick the home controller. See, the name has controller on the end. And then an index action within that controller. So home index. Let's build and see what happens. So what we should get here is something saying, hey, you hit the controller, but you know what? I can't find the view. So we can go in here to the controller, we can add a view. We're not going to use a layout yet. I'll explain in a minute what that is. I'm going to create a basic page, and it's going to be called index. I'm going to let Visual Studio put this in the appropriate place for me, and I'm going to put a paragraph. This is the first page. Here we go. This is how you create your first basic page in ASP.NET MVC. It's a combination of routing, and this is the default route to say, when you go to this URL, find this controller and this action. So it's a combination of this controller and then this controller saying return a view right here. Now by default, if you don't specify a view name, whenever a controller returns a view, it's going to return a view with the name of the action. And so index will an index action will by default return an index view. Now let's look at Solution Explorer and see what's going on. And so before we had a views directory, but we didn't have this home and we didn't have this index. When I did an add view, it added this view in this folder home. And so the convention is, if you have a home controller, you have a folder named home in the views directory, and any actions that have views will pull views out of that folder. Let's do this one more time. Let's have a page 2. So if we go here and add a view, page 2, and we look at Visual Studio over here in Solution Explorer, we're going to see that there's a page 2 now. And if we build, we should be able to go to page 2. And there you go. And that's how you create your basic pages with ASP.NET MVC. And like I said earlier, for those who are just might be coming in late, feel free, moderator, to jump in anytime and ask any questions. I'll stop here again in a minute and make sure after we get used to the view stuff that we stop and see if there's any questions about how the views work. All right. One thing that's very different about ASP.NET MVC, if you're used to web forms, is the controller action happens first. If you've done web forms, you have a path to an ASPX page, right? And so the URL comes in and it's home/food.aspx. And so the URL comes in and the page init will load, will run in the page code behind, and then the page load is running. But by that time, you're already on that page, right? This is the code behind for that specific view. This is one thing that's very different about ASP.NET MVC. In ASP.NET MVC, the controller executes first, not the view. Which means if we wanted to, we could have some decisional logic. If true, whatever your condition is, return view another view. You can totally do that in ASP.NET MVC quite easily and completely switch out the view, because it's the controller that executes first. It's not the view. The view is just simply a result. It's not the main thing. Let's do a quick example of that. So we're going to create another action. We're going to call it something. All right. ASP.NET MVC controllers are not just about views. You can actually return a good number of things from controllers. Like, for example, all right, somebody needs to mute the microphone, so I'm going to mute all except me again. Okay. So, you can return something other than a view. You get a lot of flexibility with MVC for this. So we can say return some JSON. And I'm going to return a new object, and it's going to be foo equals bar. All right. Here's a bit of JSON. Oh, and I'm also going to need, because by default it's not going to allow me to just do a get that returns JSON. So I'm going to allow this JSON here. And I'm going to go to home and then something. And so now I'm getting JSON back. If we open up Fiddler, and if you haven't used Fiddler, you should. Fiddler's very cool. So let's see what it does. So when you get your response back from Fiddler, here we go. We get our application JSON and we get the JSON back. All right. So ASP.NET MVC, you have these actions, and these actions, will more often than not, it seems, return a view, but you have more flexibility. You can return these different types of action results. View result is one of those. JSON result is another one of those. You can make an XML result. You can have a file result. You can ultimately return just about anything from these. All you have to do is, if you want to create your custom one, is inherit from this action result class. So that's the basics of how these views work. Now, if you've used many web frameworks or web forms, one thing you're used to is the idea of master pages. And right now, for page 1, our index page, and our page 2, we have all of this duplicated HTML, we have the duplicated doc type, all that kind of stuff. What we really would want to do is we'd want to have just the content for the individual pages in each of these files. And then another file that would have the layout, which would have all the outer stuff, the shell, you might say. So if we go here to views, I'm going to create a new folder. And I'm going to call it shared. And this is the default convention if you were to create a ASP.NET MVC application that has more stuff to it, not an empty application. You're going to get this same folder structure. I'm going to go to add, new item, and I'm going to say MVC4 layout page. And I'm going to call it just layout. Okay. Let's create a header. This is in the layout. Here's our H1. Now we want to use this thing. So one way to do it would be to just do this. Let's get rid of all of this stuff and just have our content. And you see where it says layout here? Let's do a path here. Let's see. Views. My goodness, I can't put the text in the right place. Views shared underscore layout dot cshtml. Alright. Let's build. Let's go back to our index page. And I would expect at this point for the layout to be there, and it is. So now we have the content from the first page, and then we would have the layout, this content from the layout, up here in the top. So that's how you do layout pages. And so for page 2, we could do the same thing. But there's another convention in ASP.NET MVC that makes all of this even a little easier. And so what you can do here is you can create a new item. And I'm going to create, doesn't really matter what it is, an underscore view start file. And so this view start file is a file that gets executed when the views under it in the folder structure get executed. And this is used to set up your views, set some variable names and whatnot. So if I go here, I can take this from that page, put it here in my view start. I can get rid of it here. Don't need it here anymore. And then on page 2, I can get rid of all this extra stuff. Here's my page 2. And now I should be able to ultimately do the same thing. Except now, for every view, I don't have to specify. So there's my index, and here's my, was it page 2 or second page? Page 2. There's my page 2, all using the layout. And all of that is defaulted because I'm using this view start file that I put here at the root of the views directory. So that's basically how views and layouts and stuff work in ASP.NET MVC. Next, it's time to jump more into how the code side of controllers works. Do we have any questions at this point that need to be answered? All right, I guess not. Let's move on. So here's the basics of server-side. Now, let's look back at this controller one more time. And let's get rid of this because, in general, I'm not sure that's always going to be a good idea. So the way MVC works, and this is also very different from how web forms typically worked, is you can view this, these controller actions as creating delayed action responses. This is what the action results are. And so if you want to redirect somebody in web forms, what you would typically do is something like response.redirect and give a URL, and they're at that point going to be redirected, right? The way MVC works is very different. You don't actually do response.redirect here. If you want to redirect somebody, you can say return redirect. And so what this will do is return an action result that tells the framework to redirect. Now this is kind of cool because what this does is this allows you to say, whenever someone calls this method, return this to the framework, and you do it. I'm not going to do it here. And so that means if you wanted to, you could do some unit tests against your controllers. Have you ever tried to, in a unit test, check to see if someone actually, if a page actually redirected someone? Annoying. But if you're doing just checks against redirect results, what you have is you just have an action result. And that action result has properties with values on it. And you can just do in your test the action result and the values on it. You're not actually testing the behavior of the framework. The assumption here is if you return a redirect result of some sort, that the framework is going to redirect them to the right place. What you're going to do in your unit test is test your logic. And so you can return this redirect to result, or this redirect to action, or this redirect to route. Many different options here. We're not going to go through them all. And so that's one thing that's different about ASP.NET MVC, which I really, really like. Now let's create a page with a little bit more substance. So on page 2, let's create a form. It is time to introduce you to HTML helpers. If you are used to ASP.NET web forms, you're used to web controls. There's text box control, there's a label control, there's a button control, there's all that. In ASP.NET MVC, we don't have things that we call controls, but there is something built in, and it's similar, but not exactly the same. It's similar, called HTML helpers. And it's the same basic idea. There's a way to package up HTML and use it over and over again within the context of your application. Let me give you a very simple example. This is an HTML begin form. HTML being the name of the helper. It's an HTML helper. And you get a form. We put a paragraph in here. Reload this page. Here's our form. Let's look in Inspector. So this HTML helper has created our form for us. Now we didn't set any settings. If you look here at HTML begin form, you can pass in things. If you don't pass in anything though, it takes your current route, and our current route is home/page 2, and it's going to post back to that same method. And notice how this form wraps this paragraph. They have this convention in the HTML helpers that if you can wrap a using around certain helpers, and it uses the whole iDisposable mechanism that you normally expect in a using, and it uses that to say, okay, anything within these brackets is wrapped in this tag that is in the using. So this is the begin form. So if you want to, you can put any inputs in here. So you can say input type equals text. And that's now going to ultimately be in your form, like so. Now, for those who aren't familiar with WebMatrix or ASP.NET MVC, this kind of notation might be a little strange for you. ASP.NET MVC, in one of its later versions, came out with something called the Razor View Engine. It originally used what was called the web form view engine. It used the same basic syntax that web forms used in terms of building up its pages and putting things on it. Razor's a very C# aware, smart templating engine. And so all I had to do is put an @ symbol before this using, and it shifted into C# mode, and so it understood that. But when it sees this bracket and then this HTML tag, it shifts out of C# mode. But then it sees this bracket and then it switches back into C# mode. So it's a very C# language aware templating language, which is awfully cool. And generally, you'll trigger running C# by doing the @ symbol. So @html.textbox, which we'll use in a minute. So that's the basics of how Razor works. So let's create a form and let's post it to the server. That's a pretty basic case for any website. One thing I like about ASP.NET MVC over web forms is you get a little bit more freedom in how you do things. Usually in web forms, if you want a control to be posting back and doing all that jazz to the server, you're going to need to inherit from web control. You can get around some of that stuff, that you certainly can, but that's the norm. That's the way you do things. In ASP.NET MVC, you get a lot more freedom. It's actually quite easy to build a form and submit it without using anything specific about the HTML helpers. I like them, though, so I'm going to end up using them. But you have that freedom. And I don't always use them in all of my applications. There's a number of forms that I build in my MVC applications that don't use hardly any helpers. It really depends on the context. But because the framework doesn't really impose any tax on that, it's easy to do, and you can choose to do it in the situations where it makes sense. So I'm going to create a submit button. Right here. All right, now I want an input. Now I want to pass a few values to the server. All right. If I want to, I can do an input of type text. I can say its name is first name if I want to, and just build myself a regular form. But we're going to use the built-in helper. So I can say HTML text box first name. Okay. And this is going to generate me some HTML. So I can say html.textbox last name, and then I can say HTML text box age. So I'm going to pass back 3 values. 2 of them are going to be text, 1 of them is going to be an integer. And by default, if we reload this, we're going to see, like we did before, that everything is going to post back to this home/page 2. Alright, so let's view our form. Right now it's awfully ugly, so let's fix that. We also have helpers for label, and last name, and age. Alright. So now I can at least see the labels here. That still looks terribly ugly. So I'm going to go into my layout, and I'm just going to drop a little style tag here. And say on my label, I'm going to say display block. So this way I can get essentially a carriage return, a new line after the labels. And also I want to put a top margin of 15 pixels on these guys. So now at least that looks pretty good. Except for my button. And for this, I'm also going to do display block. And there, I have an absolutely immaculate, beautiful form. as you can all see. So let's go back to our page. So if we look at the final generated output that these HTML helpers created for us, it created a simple label that just has a for with the names matching up for the for with the name of the element there that I'm going to be posting back to the server. So right now I could put anything I want in here. I could say Bob Smith, and he's 45 years old. I could save the form, and if we look here in Fiddler, let's start that over. That was kind of messy. There we go. Save that form. Alright. So what we've done here is a post, and we've posted our values back to the server, but not much is going on here. I mean, what's the dealio? Well, if you look back at the controller, it's going to post back to page 2. And all page 2 does is it just returns the view, right? So that's why whenever I post back, it just returns the page, because I posted values and it said, okay, well, cool, you posted values. Now return the view. Because everything that's coming to this action is just going to do the same thing. What you do in this particular kind of case is you can rename the action and have a page 2 post whatever, and then change where the form goes. Or you can do something like this. Alright, we'll have a new overload for that same method, but on this one we'll say HTTP post. And for the return on this one, I'm going to return, once again, the view, but I'm going to do something different. I'm going to say, I want to return back some text saying that, you know, I've actually posted something back. ViewBag is a cool little dynamic object that you get in ASP.NET/MVC. If you just need to pass back a little text to the view, this can be useful. And so I'm going to say ViewBag.result equals first name, last name, age, and we'll put in some simple stuff. Age, right there. So if I want to use this ViewBag result here on my page, I could do this. I could say, put a paragraph here, ViewBag result, should be good to go. So let's now see what happens when I post a form. Bob Smith, 45, save the form. If I didn't screw something up, I'll get a value. Look, I got the values I passed back. So that's basically how you'd create a form. Now here's a bit of magic that I totally love about ASP.NET/MVC. ASP.NET/MVC has this concept of model binding, and they've either added this to web forms or they're adding it to web forms in the next version. I'm not real sure. I don't pay as much attention. There's this concept of model binding. And so what it does, whenever this action here on page 2 gets executed, is it sees, first of all, okay, I have these parameters. I have a parameter named first name, I have a parameter named last name, and I have a parameter named age. And so what it will do is, since this is a post, it's going to look in the form collection. And it's going to say, is there a form key with the name first name? It is? Sweet. Let's shove that value from the form key into first name. Do I have a form key by the last name? Yes, shove that in there. Do I have a form key by name? By the name of age? Yes, shove that in that variable. And so you don't actually have to do something like, hey, there it is. So you don't have to look in the form collection, in the form collection and actually find the keys and get the values. All you got to do is you can put them up there, and it'll do that munging. It'll take those values and put them as your parameters there. And just pass them into the method. It's very fancy. There's something else I'm going to show you in a minute that's even better that I think you're really, really going to like. So that's the basic idea of model binding, and this is how you do posts. By default, if you don't put something like HTTP post or HTTP delete, you can see you have all sorts of different verb options there. If you don't put one of those on there, it will essentially accept any HTTP verb for that action. What you can do is you can say, okay, here's the default. page 2. Page 2, this particular action result will take, any request that comes in, except HTTP post, because this guy will grab it. So that way you can have ultimately just overloads, regular method overloading, and page 2 version 1 and then page 2 version 2 both work, because page 2 version 2 has the HTTP post attribute. Alright, so that's the basics. Now let's talk about models. So we've talked about views. That's this stuff. You're building your HTML. We've talked about controllers. That's this bit. The controllers are there to take in a request and say, I want to return a value, a view result, a redirect result, JSON, however you want to do it. That's the controller's job versus the view's job. Now, models. Because we don't want to just be hard coding values in, right? Sometimes you need to pass a value for the first name to fill up the form. And also, you know what? There really is a much better way to do this. Let's say you have a form with 40 inputs. You know what? I don't want a method with 40 parameters on it. That would stink. So let's talk about how models help solve this problem. If you look back at Solution Explorer, you've got that models folder. Let's start using that here. And let's create a directory for home. Let's keep this same convention of there's home views, then there's home models. I'm going to create a new class, and a model is just a regular old C# class. I'm going to call this my page 2 model. There we go, page 2 model. I don't need any of this stuff, so I'm going to create some plain old properties. Public string first name, public string last name, public string, int, nullable int, age. Alright. So what I want to do is I want to here create a new view model. I'm going to say var VM equals new page 2 model. Bring in my namespace right here, control period, for those who don't know what that shortcut is. Bring in my namespace. So now I have page 2 model, and I'm going to return him to the view. And I can set something on my view model. I can say, first name equals default name. Okay. So the models in ASP.NET MVC, the way I think of them, and I think the way most people tend to think of them, is these aren't talking about your domain models. Like if you're building an application for dating, like I do at my work, this isn't going to be my domain model of the user, and this isn't going to be my domain model of the email. This is going to be a model specifically for the view. This model's job is to just get data to and from the view, primarily to. And as you'll see in a second, you can also use it in the from. Sorry, extraneous video coming in. Excuse me, audio. Voice, mute all. Okay. Where was I? Oh yeah, models. So you can actually use those back on the input, which we'll do here in a second. So we have this model, and we're now returning it, as you can see, to the view. And I call them VM for view models, because that's what they are. They make it clear that this is a view-specific model. This is not what I'm going to be sending off to my data layer to start saving. This is just something for my view. Now, the way you make your page aware of these things is you go in here and you do this, and you say the model for this is my page 2 model. As you can see, I got some IntelliSense. Now, this is awfully nice, because now that we've set the model, we get a whole lot more IntelliSense. And so, if you redo these helpers, we can say HTML.label4. And now, instead of just putting this string in, hard-coded, into the form, I can say, use a lambda expression, say, okay, first name. And I can do the same thing for text box. Text box 4. And so that's the difference between text box and text box 4. Text box is just for creating an input on the page that has a particular name. Text box 4 is for using a lambda expression to express what you're trying to say. And I'm trying to express to say, build me a text box for first name. And so since this is a far superior way of doing this, let's real quickly create some more HTML helpers this much better way for these other values. So I'm going to say last name, and then I'm going to say age. And I'm going to reload the form. And let's see what's different. If you look at here, first of all, notice I have default name. How did that get in there? Well, click the menu option, didn't mean to. How do we get there? So we have our view, which has this default value passed in. And so since this default value is here, and page 2 references first name, it knows to put that value in because the value is in the model. And so let's say you're editing something in your domain model, and you just happen to be creating a form for editing people's first, last names, and age. And so if you're editing, you want to pre-populate the data that used to be there. So all you got to do is in your controller, when it returns the view model, populate that data. And then in the view, it'll display for you. So if you look here, we see something that looks very much like what we had before, except this. This is something that gets added. And if you use some of the built-in validation stuff in ASP.NET MVC, that's going to show up. And we're going to use some of that here in a minute. So that's one other way to create the form. So let's say Fred Jones 45. Let's at least see if our form still works. Okay, it does. Now let's go back to our controller. So let's go back to the scenario where we have a really long form and we don't want a billion parameters sitting here on this action method. So what we can do is we can actually do this. So we can say page to model. Now this is super slick to me. I loved this when I first saw it. I was ecstatic. I'm like, wow, this is really great. I have it so easy. I thought coming from web forms, I was going to have to start looking in the forms collection to start looking for things and all that jazz. But this really turned out great. And so what the framework will do is it'll, if you have simply named parameters like we did before, it'll just do a basic name match on those. But if it sees an object, it'll say, okay, I see you're an object. Clearly, you're not going to match up to something directly in the form. I'm going to look at your properties. And then if your properties match things in the form, I'm going to assign. And so that's why first name, last name, and age should still get pre-populated into that model. So let's redo this here. We should now get Frederick Jones because the model should be getting updated, and it does. So that's pretty cool. Now another thing you can do, if you have these view models, all right, if you want to, you could actually just get rid of these entirely. And you could say HTML editor for model. Now this is slick, because now what it will do is it will generate the entire form based on your model. Your model, in this case, has 2 string fields and an integer field. So let's see what happens whenever we reload this page. As you can see, we get our 2 text fields. But also, notice here, we're in Chrome, so Chrome has the number input. So if we look here at the source, we can see all this extra stuff that generated for us. And in this case, for this editor field for the number value, you can see that this is in fact a type number. So if you have a browser that has a specific rendering or a specific way of handling inputs for certain types, this will automatically generate it for you. And if you want to mess with things and like change the names of how these work, you know what? You can actually do that on the model. You can add validation. You can also add things for how things are displayed. You can also put attributes to say, okay, I don't want this to be an integer. I want this to be something else. So you get all of that kind of flexibility with it, and you don't actually have to type out the entire form. That is, in my mind, awfully handy. So since we have this here, let's also put some validation in. Because right now, we'll allow anything. We'll allow anything in here. So if we don't put any values here, if we don't put any values here, we can do save form, but we don't have any values, and so it's just building basically that string that just had our delimiters in there. And that's totally not cool. If we want, we can make things required just by, no, let's not go there. Let's go here. So here's our page 2. Here's our post. If you want to, you could do manual validation. You could say model state dot add model error. So this is ultimately how the stuff I'm about to show you is going to be working behind the scenes. You can add a model error, for example, first name, and you can say something like, you did it very, very wrong. All right. So if we go here and let's just do a post. It has noticed that, okay, I'm adding the model error. There's no logic around this, and it's adding an error here. And so that's kind of lame. So let's say if vm.firstName, let's check to see if string.is null or empty. And if it's null or empty, add that validation bit. So now let's repost the form empty. Now let's repost it, and we're good. So that's the the hardcore way of doing the validation. But we don't want to do that most of the time. There's much nicer ways for doing basic form validation. And here's what you can do. And so I'm going to go into my view model, and I'm going to put this required on the first name, and I'm going to add in this namespace. And now let's repost that form. Everything's good because there's a value. Now let's repost it, and it says the first name field is required. And so we can now annotate. These are called data annotations. We can now annotate our view model and give it the behavior we want to give it. Like, for example, saying something is required. And we can even specify a name in here. So we can say, what's our name parameters? Well, our error message is, you are a failure when it comes to entering form data. Maybe not something you want to tell your users normally, but hey, you have the freedom. So there you go. You're a failure when it comes to entering form data. And so I think you can see that when you're using aspConfGettingStartedWithMVC, as a general rule, it's very helpful to go this model route. You get these data annotations that allow you to customize how the form would look, but also put validation in. And there's different types of validation that you can use. You also get very nice IntelliSense here. Just in case you didn't notice before, you get HTML, text box for X, is your lambda expression. You get the actual properties on your view model. This is awfully nice because now you don't have to worry about misspellings. And so you misspell something and you wonder why something isn't working. Well, you don't have to do that anymore because you get this nice, strongly typed models for your views. Major cool. So that's the basics of how validation works. Well, actually, I want to show you one more thing. Let's check here if the validation failed or not, and do something different whenever we return the view. Validation, whenever you use these data annotation validations, is something that happens before you get here. So by the time you get to the controller, the validation has already happened, and it's something the framework does for you. So you can say, if model state dot is valid, then I want to set this as my view result. Well, in my view bag anyway. Else, I want to say you failed. And sometimes, you know what, you could also do very different things. You know what, you don't have to return a view. If they failed and you're really angry at them, you can actually return a redirect and redirect them somewhere else if they did something wrong on the form. Well, terrible user experience, but you can do that because just because you're posting back to this action doesn't mean you have to always return a view result. You can return them somewhere else. All right, so here we go. Let's leave that blank. Let's get our you failed. Oh man, bummer. So let's now post Bob Smith back. Now he's 60 years old. And so now we passed the validation scenario. So that's the basics of server-side MVC, how that all works. All that I think is fantastic. It's a lot of fun. I want to show you one more thing before we go and we take what we've learned and we move into creating a new web application. All right, not using the empty template, and that is the ability to define sections in the layout. As you probably have had before, you've had a need where, sure, it's cool to be able to put this body stuff into the page, but sometimes you want to be able to change the text outside of that within the context of the layout. That's where sections come in the whole Razor view engine thing, how these Razor files work. So you can say render section, and you can give it a name, and we're going to give it the name header stuff. All right, and very important, we're going to put this. It is not actually required. Not every page has to put in this section. And so what we can do is we can say, okay, section header stuff. Oops. Okay, so section header stuff. Now we can inline HTML. So I put this in the header. All right. Reload this page. I put this in the header. But if you go to index, it's not going to be there. This is sections. It gives you ability, to put stuff into the general layout other than, just the section of the page that you're normally working on. Very handy when you need it. So let's look back at our solution and see where we've come. We've got routes. And routes basically match up URLs to controllers and actions. That's what they do. If you have a home/index, this is going to go to the home controller and look for an action name index. If you want to create another page, you want it to have zoo, and that's your controller, and you want it to return monkeys, you can do that. All you need is a zoo controller with a monkeys action. All right? Now also, if you don't have anything, notice this. With your routing, it has some defaults. So if you don't specify an ID, then you're not going to get anything. If you don't specify an action, well, it's going to by default be index. And if you don't specify a controller, it's going to by default be home. That's why this is equivalent to that. So that's routing. We've also seen controllers. Those are just your general controlling mechanism. You get an input in, and you decide how you're going to respond. You're going to return a view, you're going to return a redirect, you're going to return JSON, or whatever you want to return. And we've also seen models. Models interact with views. Controllers will populate your models, and they'll pass them to your views. And your views use those models to render the forms, but then you can also use those models when you post back to the server. And the model binding will put all of that data back together again, put it in the model, and so you get this nice capability here where you have a pre-filled object for you whenever you have a post. So that's the basics. Now let's create a new project. So I told you we were going to start from the little things into the big things. We started with the little things. At this point, you've seen most of the big things. So let's do a new ASP.NET MVC4 application. We're going to create an internet application. And if you look down here at the bottom, it's adding all sorts of NuGet packages. A basic ASP.NET MVC application has no controllers, it has no views in it, and it has very few NuGet packages. But if you create an internet application, you already get several different controllers. You also get a number of views, and you also get some CSS already for you, which is kind of nice. So your error states and whatnot are already styled for you. And if you run this guy, which we shall do, you'll see a much nicer looking application. It's not the blank one that we had before. This has its own style sheet and its own views and already pre-populated text. Very nice. So now, knowing what we know, let's take a look at things. All right, so how do we get that home action? If you look here, nothing on the URL. There's no home, no index. Well, if you look at the routing, you can see that they have that same route, controller, action, and ID with the defaults. So if you want to make your way to find the action that's generating that first home page, well, here it is, home controller index action. See, it's using this view bag and specifying a message. So if you look back here, we can say, modify this template to kickstart your ASP.NET MVC, modify this template to kickstart your ASP.NET MVC application. So that's ultimately how that works. Pretty cool. And so if you look at this basic home controller, it's just a bunch of views. It's passing data back to the view. You can pass it through this, or you can hard code it on the view, whatever makes sense. So let's go and just look at this index controller. It's obviously it has a lot more HTML, but there's nothing, nothing special about it. You don't see, strange controls. You don't see ASP colon and then a web control or something like that. It's just HTML. With the exception of right here, we've got this section that they've defined. Now if we look in the shared folder and then the layout, you've got your HTML, shell that you can put everything into. And so if we look for, what's that section? That section is called featured. So here's the featured section. And so if something comes in here, it's going to be rendered here at the top of the body, here in the layout page. This is how you would do some basic forms. And a internet application, when you create, with the default template, comes with forms authentication already built in for you. So you can see some things that very much like what we saw before. Here's a login URL, which allows you to, which returns a view. But you can post back to that same login URL. Notice the HTTP post. And it's taking in a model. And this model has the username and the password and the remember me checkbox value. So it's passing in this model. And then it's doing its work. And then it's either redirecting you to the home controller and the index action, or it's redirecting you to this return URL that was set. And then you have a log off, which will do a forms authentication sign out, and then some other views. Let's see what else is in here. Bundle config. This is for the script minimization and combining stuff that's in MVC. Different topic. Actually, it's not in MVC. It's in ASP.NET in general. Interesting stuff. We're actually using it at work right now. Works really well. Filter config. Not going to talk about that at the moment. Content. This is the base content that comes with it. You've got some jQuery UI, CSS in here. Basic images, views. It has already put some scripts in here for you. So you have jQuery in here by default. You have jQuery UI, and then some other scripts that we didn't have in the other project. So we've already looked at the views, and the web config is a bit more complicated than the other because it put more stuff in it. But that's what you would expect. We actually have more packages, and this has more built in for you. So now you can see, because we started from the little bits to the big bits. This is how, if you're going to start, if you don't want to start with a blank template, this is what you're going to see. But it's not really any more complicated. It's just already done for you. And it's those same little bitty pieces put together. So let's talk about filters for a second. If you look here in the app start and you got your filter config, what filters are these are attributes that you can put on controllers and actions. So if we go here, you could say, here's a filter. This is the authorization filter. This is a filter that works with forms authentication in ASP.NET. The way filters work is they don't primarily actually, in my mind, filter. I'm sure they had a good reason for the name, but they don't just take stuff out of a request and then return you a smaller request, which is what you would normally have with a filter, right? It keeps stuff out. The idea of the filter is it can, before a request is executed or after a request is executed, can do things. In the case of authentication, you can use the authorize attribute to say, okay, this controller, someone has to be authorized with forms authentication. So if they request the controller action, don't show it, because I have the authorize attribute on here. If they're not logged in, don't show it, and redirect them to where they need to log in. That's the basic function of filters. It'd be kind of heinous to, everywhere you wanted someone, if someone had to be logged in to get to a particular page, it would be heinous to go in there and say, okay, and actually write code, if, is authenticated, blah, 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 right? That would be heinous. What's much better is to say, all right, I'm going to put this little bit of reusable code, this little reusable filter code, and so I can just put it on actions, or I can put it on controllers and apply this all over your application without duplicating code all over the place. This is a fantastic capability. Now, this allow anonymous attribute will allow an anonymous user to get there. So those are filters. You get a number of different ways of actually jumping into the MVC framework and changing how things work. If you're like me, you've worked at a place that decided that they really needed to modify how the framework worked by default. Meaning, like, for example, web forms. At Match, in most of our sites, we have a very customized view of web forms. In some ways, it's like web forms. In some ways, it's not like web forms at all, because we've really changed how things work to give us capabilities that weren't in the box. This is probably fairly normal for places. You can do that in web forms, but it always feels like you're really jumping through a hoop. That's how I always felt. That it always seemed really hard, really way too hard to do this kind of thing. ASP.NET MVC is a little bit, excuse me, I take that back. I think it's a lot easier to extend. If you want to, you can change how the model binding works very easily. If you want to, you can add filters and change how filters work pretty easily. If you want to, you know what, you can change out your view engine. So the view engine in MVC is something that says, takes a controller request, sees this view and says, okay, go look up my view. It's a relatively trivial thing in ASP.NET MVC to create a new view engine to say, you know what, look in a different place. Don't follow the normal conventions. Or what you can do, and many people have done this, is you can say, you know what, I don't want to use the default view engine. I want to use the Spark view engine. Or I want to use a Enhamel type view engine. I want to have a completely different way of building forms and rendering views than what ASP.NET MVC gives me, because I don't like it. Well, that's not hard to do. All you have to do is create a new view engine, tell the framework, don't use your default, use mine, and it'll use it. It's a very extensible framework. That's one reason why I like it. It's a lot easier to do that kind of thing, and I don't feel like I'm fighting against the framework to do it. Now, I believe they've made a lot of this a lot easier in web forms. Whenever I was doing web forms last, it was back in ASP.NET 2 days. So I think they've really made a lot of strides there. But that's where MVC came from. It came from looking at other MVC frameworks on the web and using some of their really good ideas. It also came from some of the pains in ASP.NET web forms. It's hard to do these things. Let's make these things easier to do in MVC. And there's still a few things today that are probably easier to do in web forms. If I had a site that was entirely made of tables over data, you know what? I would build that in web forms. I definitely would. Most sites, I find MVC to be just as easy or easier and a lot easier to configure and customize. And so that's why I pretty much these days always use MVC, because I don't remember the last time I created an app that was just tables over data. That's the basic idea, and I wanted to cover all of that in about an hour, and we've done it in exactly an hour. So now is the time for questions. Now, I can show you some other things if you want. I can show you a little Ajax using a little jQuery if you want. That's cool. Or if you have questions about some of the things that we've discussed before, or just something else about ASP.NET MVC, now is the time. So anybody have anything?
Hi Eric, this is David Christensen, one of the moderators. I've got some questions here.
Fantastic, thank you.
Okay, so Nissen Garg, sorry if I got your name wrong there. He says, I could not get where we should use redirect in place of return. Would you be able to describe where you'd use a redirect instead of a return?
Right. So let me explain how that basically works. So in ASP.NET, whenever you do a redirect, it's throwing an exception, right? Because it's aborting the thread, essentially. It's throwing an exception to say, hey, go somewhere else. Now, if you're going to write a test library, like if you're going to use Inut or something, and you're going to be testing a controller action, and you want to say, okay, I could enter this situation, do a redirect in this controller action, and you want to wrap an automated test around that. What you're going to be doing is have to basically make your test aware of not only how the exception is being thrown, but also pull out of that the data to say, okay, now the exception is being thrown to redirect. Okay, now I got to find the URL in that. Let me show you something right here. Let's go back to our first project. These helper methods to return views, all they do is they actually return action result instances. And in this case, we have a redirect result. And let's say the redirect result is HTTP google.com. We're redirecting someone to Google for some strange reason. All right, so if you look at this result, we could say URL, and this will give us that URL that was in the redirect result. Now think in terms of a testing scenario. If you want to test that the user is going to get redirected in a certain scenario to Google, you can go to the trouble of dealing with the exception and then pulling out of that exception data where they're going to be redirected. Or you could simply do, we're just going to use without IntelliSense, is, what's it, art equal? I think that's the in unit. You could say, that, and that could be your test. You execute the result, you execute the action, you get the result back, and you could do a simple test between the two. It just makes things a lot easier. Or, for example, let's say you're not doing a redirect result. Let's say you're doing a view result, okay? Now, view result, you can set some things. You can say result dot master name, and you can set the master, or you can set the view name. Or you can set something on the view bag. You can say the view bag dot foo equals bar. Now, in your testing scenario, how are you going to automate the testing of this? Well, if it's actually rendering the view, then you'll have to look at the rendered view, get that, and then have your test go and find in the DOM that, okay, did bar actually get output where the variable viewbag.foo is? Or you would ultimately just in your test execute this controller action and say, assert.r equal bar, and then you would say result viewbag foo. So instead of actually executing the view, or instead of actually executing the redirect, it's returning a result that says, you know what, framework, I want you to execute this redirect, or I want you to execute this result. You actually get a nice object that's really easy to interrogate for testing. If you want to do unit testing on your controllers, this makes things a lot easier than actually trying to test the running framework, because ultimately what you're doing here is you're no longer testing the running framework. You're testing the code that you put between the brackets in this method. And that's easier. You don't have to do any bootstrapping. You don't have to get the framework spun up and somehow say, okay, render this view without me having to do a web request or something like that. I believe there's actually a session on doing unit testing of views later on, either today or tomorrow. And so that's going to be interesting. I've seen some people do it. I'm kind of interested in that session. But you know what? This is really easy to unit test, because I'm just really testing my code and my expectations. What do I expect to happen given that I have executed my controller, given the inputs? What do I expect to happen in a particular case? Do I expect this variable to come back? Do I expect a redirect result to come back? What do I want to see? And so that's why I like these action results. It's this deferred execution. It's not doing the thing, it's telling the framework to do the thing.
Okay, so another question here is from Peter Neville. What about dynamic validators in a form? So going back to your view models, what about dynamic validators in a form?
So dynamic validators, do we mean, I'm not exactly sure what we mean by dynamic there. Do you mean validating something that is of type dynamic, or do we mean something
Well,
else.
maybe Peter, if you're still around, you could ask us a follow-up question with a bit more detail there. Let's see what else we've got. Eric, if you want to open up your Q&A, you can see the questions. You should be able to see the questions yourself. See if you can pick any you like.
So, okay.
Your manage is empty there. We just go to manage.
Yeah, my manage is empty. Oh, here's. There we go.
Oh, there we go.
There we go. So Brian raised his hand. Brian, ask your question later. These are...
Well, so what are your thoughts on using web forms and MVC in the same ASP.NET site? And that's from Johan.
That's actually fine. It works. It works wonderfully. A lot of people will do this whenever they're converting a web forms application to an MVC application. You know, if you have a big site, that's a really big task. And often the big rewrite, A, doesn't work, and B, you can't get management to buy off on it. And so what you do is you just convert piece by piece. I've done this several times, and it's really easy to do. And so that's the most common scenario I see people when people do it. But you know what? If you have a scenario where you have a lot of data grids on part of the application, but the rest of it you want to do in MVC, that's fine. Actually works great. And here's a question here. Can you elaborate on your definition of tables over data style apps, please? So these are the type of apps where, and I'm sure a lot of you have seen these type of apps, where you have your schema, you have your database and all your tables there, and you have a bunch of views in your app that allow you to edit the data in those tables. And so you have a bunch of data grids, you know, in a bunch of different pages. You have a data grid for your person table, right? And so this data grid gives you edit and delete actions and whatnot onto that data and gives people an easy way to edit the data. You know, there's a lot of code generation scenarios that are built that way. That's what I mean, this tables over data style apps. Building those kind, I think, are still easier to do in web forms than they are in ASP.NET MVC. There's very little, if anything, I can think of that's easier in web forms than MVC other than that. Once you get used to MVC, it's a very fast development environment. But that is still easier to do in web forms. And so that's what I mean. If you're going to have a bunch of data grids, you know data grids, big tables of data, edit buttons, you know, master detail kind of stuff. That is still a bit easier to do in my mind with web forms. So.
Okay, so I've got two questions here relating to areas. One basically saying, can you give a quick overview of what areas are? And another question saying, how are areas different from sections? So a wee bit of clarity needed there, I think.
All right. So areas. Areas was something that wasn't in ASP.NET MVC 1. I think it came in 2. If not, it came in 3. Basically, let's look at this scenario. Let's say you have a big app, and you have several hundred different pages. That means you're going to have a lot of controllers. You can have all those controllers here in this controllers directory, and that actually works fine. Some people like another layer of organizing your controllers. That's essentially what areas are. Let's see. So we can say here, add area. So let's go back to our zoo. We're going to add a zoo area. Boom. Because who wouldn't have a zoo area? And so we're going to have, if you look here in Solution Explorer, you have this new section called areas. And this has its own controllers, own models, and its own views. So let's create a monkeys controller. And we're going to create, okay, so monkeys controller. We're going to return a view, and we're going to say, just generate me a view. Add view. And you know what we forgot to do earlier, which I meant to do, is this dialog gives you a lot of options. And you could create, whenever we created our model, you could create your strongly typed view from here. You could also say, use a layout or a master page and whatnot. So we're going to go ahead and do that here. So this is our index view for our monkeys in our zoo. So now, assuming everything's good, we should be able to go zoo monkeys index. So there we go. So areas are a way of subdividing your controllers and views and models. that's all I view them as. They are just an organizational way of putting things. You don't have to use them to organize. You can totally customize where you put your views and how you put your controllers and whatnot. Areas are just a convenient way of doing it, and that's an area. Now, how do areas differ from sections? Sections are just pluggable spots within your layout that you can put things, and the view can put things in the sections, and they'll show up where they need to on the layout. That's the purpose of sections. Where areas is a way of just sectioning off whole sections of controllers and views and models and saying, this is this one area. And so if you want to go to the zoo for all the monkeys and the lions and the tigers and all that kind of stuff, you go to that controller. And then you go to that area and look at all those controllers. Where I've commonly done this before is when I would create an API, I would commonly come in here and say add new area, and I would say okay, API. And the MVC controllers are great for just building basic endpoints, easy endpoints for AJAX calls. So you can come in here and create a controller. Now they've built Web API, and it looks really nice to use. I haven't hardly used it much, which is why I'm going to be probably watching that session that's either today or tomorrow that introduces you to Web API. That's how they're recommending going forward, doing this kind of thing. Looks like a very flexible mechanism for doing it. But what I used to do is I'd create an area for an API often, and I would then create my controllers in here. And all the controllers in here would be returning JSON. They wouldn't be returning views, because this is just what I'm going to hit with my JavaScript. So those are areas.
Follow up in this section. Jerry asks a question here. I'll read it, and I think I understand what he's trying to say. Will the section contents be rendered on the location of the layout page where the section is defined, or will it be rendered on the view page where the section content is defined? So does it matter in what order? I think and Jerry, correct me if I'm wrong, I think what Jerry's saying is, does it matter in what order you specify your sections in a view page?
So here we are in our page 2, and here's our section for header stuff. And if you look at our layout, let's see what happens. I always put my sections at the top. So render section header stuff. Okay. Let's get back to page 2. Page 2. So this is my section. All right. So I'm going to take my section. If I remember right, it doesn't matter at all. It's just going to take that section and inline it, just like normal. So yeah, the order in this file doesn't really matter. All that matters is that you put stuff in it, and in terms of where it shows up in the DOM, it's just going to be where the section is defined.
So the answer is no. It doesn't matter.
Yes, does not matter. Good question, though.
Yeah, it's a good question. Let's see. You might want to have a look at your Q&A as well, just to see if you can pick out anything.
Can I define view model, data model, and domain model? Sure. When I think of, and I'm not going to worry about the data model word, when I think of domain model, I think of my main business logic objects, if I have them in an app, and usually I do. These are going to be objects with quite a bit of functionality on them sometimes. They could just be data transfer objects that just have properties on them. That's another term for some people. Or they could be a domain model that you have a person, and that person might have methods on it and whatnot. Or even if it is just properties that have data, you know what? I often will keep that separate from my view models, because what will often be the case is how you store your data in your database is different than how you store how you view your data on the form. If you're rendering out models to the form, all right, and you need to specify some text that goes out there, if it's something that's not on not in your database and not on your domain model, if you're using your domain model and returning it to the view and you need the data, then you have to change your domain model. And so now it has the properties that you would get from your database, for example, and it has the properties that you would use on the view. But now that property is there everywhere in the application, even though you don't use it everywhere in the application. You only use it in the view. this is where view models can be very useful. And so if you have your person object that has all the information about the person, but you want to combine first name and last name, and you want to do some date formatting, and you want to put a custom paragraph based on some of their data into the view, well, instead of putting all of those properties on your main object that you use throughout the application, you create a view model for that page. And you assign all the values to the properties for that view model, and the page uses that view model. It doesn't use your primary domain model, your primary business object. And so that's how I distinguish between the two. They don't have to be distinguished. I think it's a really good pattern to do so. But they don't technically have to. You can do whatever you want. You can use the same objects, pull them directly out of the database. You can pass them to the view. You have that freedom. I won't generally do that. It'll depend on the app.
Brief question here. Sorry, Eric, did you finish that? Sorry.
No, go ahead.
Okay. I think it's a quick one. I think it's the authorized attributes. What is the better way to implement access control on different pages in MVC? And that's asked by Sergio.
All I've really had to do is do basic forms authentication. So I haven't done a whole lot in terms of using roles and whatnot in MVC, so I'm not going to attempt to answer that, other than I've used the basic authorized attribute and forms authentication, and that's worked for me. So, sorry.
Okay, so we've got 5 minutes left, so just trying to find maybe 2 more questions.
While you're looking at that, let me say something. I believe if you go to live.aspconf, there should be in there a speaker rate URL for this session. Oh, there it is right there. Do me a favor, when you're done with this, go to speaker rate and rate this talk. Give me comments on what you thought about it. Would love to hear what you have to say, things you liked, more importantly, things you didn't like. Please do that after the talk. Anyway, sorry, go ahead.
Okay, I actually think we're out of time now, so yeah.
Okay, I'll hang out a little bit in the Jabber chat room for room 2. I've been completely ignoring it so far, just obviously because I've been working on the presentation. I'll spend a little bit of time in here before I go to work. If you have any questions, you can jump over there and ask me questions. So, thanks everyone. You've been a great crowd. Shoot me emails if you want. You can contact me on Twitter. My email address, just so you know, is eric.sell@gmail.com. IntelliSense. And on Twitter, I am Malioc is my name. So if you need to contact me, that's the best way to do it. Hey, and thanks for being my proctor for me. I appreciate it.
No worries. Thank you very much, Eric.
All right, so I'll see you guys in the chat room. Thanks a lot.